She arrived at the music school quietly, with her small bag slung over one shoulder and her notebook tucked under her arm. No one noticed her much in the hallways. She was the kind of student who stayed in the background, who never raised her hand too eagerly and never drew attention to herself. Her hair was always pulled back neatly, her clothes simple, and her movements calm and measured. Most of the time, she walked as if she was in her own world, a world that no one else could see. From the outside, she seemed ordinary. Teachers knew her name, but could not remember much about her personality. Fellow students said little about her, not because she was unfriendly, but because she made no effort to shine in group activities. Yet, there was something about the way she handled her sheet music, how her fingers lightly touched the piano keys during practice, that hinted at a quiet depth. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. Only those who watched closely might notice it. She had started playing piano as a child, guided by her parents who recognized early on that she had an unusual sensitivity to music. They never pushed her, and she never forced herself. She spent hours at home, not for praise or recognition, but because it was a world where she felt at ease. Music became a companion, a friend that understood without words. By the time she entered the school, her skills were steady, yet unremarkable to most observers. She never competed, never sought accolades, and so many assumed she was just another student among many. On this particular morning, the school was buzzing with activity. Students hurried across the hallways, carrying instrument cases or rushing to rehearsals. She moved through it all with her usual quiet pace, noticing the minor details others often missed. The polished floor, the sunlight streaming through the high windows, the faint smell of varnished wood from the piano room. It was a sensory routine she appreciated. Her practice was scheduled for mid-morning, and she liked arriving early. It gave her time to settle her thoughts and feel the instrument beneath her hands. Before anyone else arrived, when she entered the practice room, it was empty. She set her bag down gently, opened the piano bench, and sat carefully. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, as if listening for a sound only she could hear. Then she began. The notes flowed naturally, softly at first, almost like a whisper of wind brushing against leaves. Her movements were confident but gentle, precise but unforced. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like simple practice, but for her, it was a dialogue, a conversation between herself and the piano. The teachers often walked past during these times. Some glanced at her and nodded politely, perhaps noting that she had a routine, a sense of discipline. Others barely registered her presence, assuming she was just another student following instructions. No one ever stopped to listen for long. No one ever asked her to play something more challenging. To the school, she was quiet, steady, and perhaps slightly ordinary. Her classmates were a different story. Some were flashy performers, always eager to show off a difficult piece or impress the teachers. They talked about competitions, awards, and performances, sharing stories of their victories and failures. She never joined these conversations, though she listened sometimes, curious but detached. She did not care for accolades, nor did she measure her progress against others. Music, for her, was not about winning. It was about understanding, feeling, and expressing something deeper than applause or recognition. On this day, the mood of the school was especially lively. A senior recital was approaching, and students were preparing to showcase their talents. There was excitement, tension, and a little nervousness floating in the air. Teachers were assigning pieces, giving instructions, and reminding students of deadlines. Among them, her own teacher approached, a woman known for her strict standards and high expectations. The teacher's eyes lingered on her, a mixture of curiosity and slight frustration in her gaze. She had observed the young woman for months, noting her practice habits and her consistent attendance. Yet, she remained puzzled. There was no display of extraordinary talent during group lessons, no overt brilliance in her performances, nothing to suggest she was anything more than average. The teacher often shook her head silently, thinking that perhaps the student lacked ambition or initiative. Today, however, the teacher had a plan. She wanted to push the young woman, to see if she could rise to a challenge. Perhaps, she thought, this would awaken a spark, show her what she was truly capable of. With that intention, she approached and spoke in her firm, measured voice. "I want you to learn this piece. It's difficult, but I think you're ready." The piece was known in the school for its complexity, often reserved for advanced students nearing graduation. The teacher expected hesitation, or maybe even a quiet complaint. To her surprise, the young woman simply nodded. She did not ask why it was assigned to her, nor did she express doubt. She accepted the challenge with calm determination that the teacher left. Watching the student pick up the sheet music, in the silence that followed, she opened the pages carefully, her eyes scanning the notes. At first, she frowned slightly, noting the intricacy of the composition. There were rapid scales, complex chords, and passages that demanded both technical skill and emotional depth. Many students would have felt overwhelmed at this moment, but she only studied it, reading and absorbing the music as if it were another language. Hours passed in quiet practice. She broke the piece into sections, focusing on each measure with patience. When mistakes happened, she did not get frustrated. Instead, she repeated the section slowly, analyzing what was wrong and how to correct it. She experimented with dynamics, tempo, and expression, discovering subtle nuances within the notes. To her, it was not a task assigned by the teacher. It was a puzzle waiting to be understood, a story waiting to be told through the piano. Her classmates came and went, some peeking into the room, curious about what she was doing. They noticed the focus, the intensity in her eyes, and the way her fingers moved with both precision and ease. Yet, none of them guessed the level of skill developing in those quiet hours. Her talent was hidden in plain sight, shielded by her unassuming demeanor and lack of self-promotion. By afternoon, her fingers ached slightly, but she did not stop. She moved to the next section, connecting phrases, exploring transitions, and building a sense of continuity. Each note, each chord, became part of a larger story, not just a technical exercise. She listened to the music as it unfolded, adjusting subtly, letting the piano respond to her touch. There was an intimacy in the room, a silent exchange that no one else could witness. Outside the practice room, teachers discussed schedules, student progress, and upcoming recitals. Her name occasionally came up, but always with a tone of mild concern or curiosity. They wondered if she would rise to the challenge, if she had the potential to perform something truly impressive. No one suspected that she was already surpassing expectations quietly, away from prying eyes. By the evening, she had practiced for hours, her mind and body fully engaged. She leaned back slightly on the bench, letting her hands rest. The piece was far from perfect, but she understood it in a way that went beyond memorization or technique. She felt it in her chest, in her fingertips, in the rhythm of her breath. Music was not something she played. It was something she lived, something she experienced deeply and personally. Her parents arrived to pick her up. They stood silently at the door, watching her for a moment. They did not interrupt, knowing she preferred these quiet moments alone. As they called her name softly, she turned and smiled briefly, a calm, quiet smile that carried no need for explanation. She packed her bag carefully, closed the piano lid, and left the room. The day's practice had been long and demanding, yet fulfilling. She walked through the hallways again, noticing small details, listening to the sounds of the school, feeling the rhythm of life around her. No one outside that practice room realized the transformation that had quietly begun. The teachers still assumed she was ordinary. The students still thought of her as reserved, and the world remained unaware of the genius hidden behind her calm exterior. She returned home, tired but content, carrying with her the music that had spoken to her, the challenge that had been given, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was growing in ways no one else yet understood. That evening, as she sat at the piano in her own home, she revisited the piece. Each time she played, it became clearer, more fluid, more expressive. She experimented with subtle changes in timing, the pressure of her fingers, and the depth of her touch. Every practice session revealed something new, something deeper. She was not just learning the notes, she was learning herself, discovering the limits of her patience, her sensitivity, and her ability to communicate through music. Her parents watched from a distance, careful not to disturb her concentration. They had always known she was special, but even they could not fully explain the quiet intensity she brought to the piano. Her world was private, yet profoundly rich. Music was not a stage or a performance for her. It was a companion, a reflection of her inner life, a language she had mastered without even realizing it. The night grew late, and she finally closed the piano lid with gentle care. Her mind buzzed with melodies, harmonies, and rhythms that lingered long after her fingers had stopped moving. The next morning, the music school seemed louder, more chaotic than usual. Students were talking in clusters, sharing practice experiences, and discussing upcoming performances. She walked quietly through the hall, her bag slung over one shoulder, her eyes focused on the polished floor beneath her feet. She was aware of the usual chatter, but it seemed distant, as if she were listening through a fog. She preferred this calm, this separation from the excitement, because it allowed her mind to focus on the piece that had been assigned the day before. The difficult piece that, in her teacher's eyes, was meant to test her. The teacher found her first thing in the morning, standing by the piano room door, waiting patiently. Her expression was firm, hinting at both expectation and a quiet challenge. The teacher said nothing at first, just gestured for her to come inside. Inside, the room was bathed in sunlight that fell across the polished wooden floor and bounced off the piano keys. The instrument seemed almost alive in the light, waiting for her to awaken it with her fingers. The teacher handed her the sheet music once more and reminded her, in a sharp but controlled voice, that the piece was extremely difficult. She suggested that this was a test of her skill, her dedication, and her ability to push beyond what she believed she could do. She took the sheet music without a word. There was no hint of nervousness or doubt on her face. She understood the challenge, but she did not fear it. Instead, there was a quiet focus, a calm readiness that seemed to absorb the tension in the room. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play, first slowly, tracing the notes carefully, then gradually letting her intuition guide her fingers. The teacher watched closely, leaning against the doorway, noting every movement, every hesitation, every moment of confidence. She expected to see struggle, but what she saw instead was careful control, a growing fluidity, and a surprising depth of musical understanding. Hours passed. She moved from one section to the next, breaking down complicated measures, experimenting with rhythm and expression, and adjusting phrasing as she went. When she stumbled over a particularly difficult passage, she did not get frustrated or complain. Instead, she slowed, analyzed the sequence, and repeated it with precision until her hands remembered the correct movement. It was not mechanical repetition. It was learning with purpose, discovering the nuances hidden in the notes outside the practice room. Other students whispered and speculated. Some noticed her dedication and whispered among themselves, surprised at the intensity she showed. Some doubted she could master the piece, assuming that her quiet nature equaled limited talent. A few admired her patience and focus, sensing a hidden skill, though none could fully explain it. Her quiet presence had always been mysterious, and now, as she tackled a piece far beyond what others thought she could do, that mystery only deepened. By midday, the teacher was growing restless. She expected signs of struggle, perhaps frustration or impatience. Instead, the students' fingers moved with increasing confidence, the notes connecting into smooth passages, the rhythm flowing naturally. The teacher began to feel a mixture of astonishment and disbelief. This student, whom she had assumed was average, was navigating the complexity with grace and intuition. She realized that she might have underestimated her completely. The young woman did not pause for lunch or breaks in the way most students did. She was immersed in the music, adjusting dynamics, exploring tempo, and refining subtle touches that made the piece come alive. She experimented with volume, touch, and timing, noticing how small changes could dramatically alter the emotion the piece conveyed. It was as if she were discovering secret layers of the composition that were invisible to everyone else. Meanwhile, teachers from other classrooms began to take notice. The faint sound of the piano carried through the hallways, and a few colleagues paused to listen. They noticed the smoothness of the performance, the depth of expression, and the skill with which the young woman executed complex passages. Whispers began to circulate about the student who had always gone unnoticed, but now seemed to possess extraordinary talent. Some teachers exchanged puzzled glances, unsure if they were seeing a natural genius or a student who had finally put in exceptional effort. Her classmates continued their usual routines, but some could not resist sneaking peeks into the room. They were captivated, watching the young woman work with an intensity that was rare among students. Her fingers flew over the keys with precision and elegance, moving from intricate arpeggios to challenging chords without hesitation. Yet, she never played for attention or admiration. She played because it was necessary to understand, to express, to explore. Her passion was quiet but profound, a force that drew others in without effort. By late afternoon, fatigue began to set in. Her hands ached, and her mind was exhausted from the mental focus required to master the piece. She paused, leaning back on the piano bench, taking slow, deliberate breaths. The teacher observed silently, realizing that despite the challenge and the long hours, the student remained fully engaged. There was no sense of giving up, no sign of defeat, only a calm, steady resolve to continue. The teacher felt a mixture of admiration and regret, recognizing that she had misjudged the student all along, Finally, she stood, stretching her arms and shaking out the tension in her fingers. She glanced at the teacher, her face calm and composed. There was no boastful expression, no demand for praise, only a quiet confidence that came from the knowledge that she had grown, even if only in small, incremental steps. She had begun to understand the piece more deeply, not just the technical challenges but the emotional depth it required. She had made the music her own, and in that process, she had proven her abilities without needing anyone else to witness it. The teacher stepped closer, her expression softening. She had expected a struggle, a failure even, but what she saw was mastery in progress. She realized that the student's quiet nature had hidden an innate genius that no one had fully appreciated. The lesson for her was clear. Appearances could be deceiving, and talent often did not announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it existed in the quiet, the unnoticed, the patient effort that went unseen. When other students returned from their breaks, the teacher invited a few to listen. They were amazed, their initial disbelief giving way to awe. The young woman continued to play without acknowledging their presence. Fully absorbed in the music, they watched, understanding for the first time that she was not simply practicing. She was creating, interpreting, and discovering in real time. The realization was quiet but profound. They had underestimated her completely. As the day drew to a close, the student carefully closed the piano lid, her mind still buzzing with melodies and rhythms. She packed her bag, thanked the teacher with a simple nod, and walked out of the room. There was no celebration, no announcement of triumph, only a calm satisfaction. She had faced a challenge that had been imposed upon her and had begun to rise to it. On her own terms, she had proven her capability. But more importantly, she had discovered her own depth and potential. Walking through the hallways, she noticed the subtle changes in the way students looked at her. Some were curious, others impressed, and a few uncertain. She did not dwell on their reactions. For her, the experience had been internal, a journey of growth and understanding. The recognition, if it came later, was secondary. She had learned something about herself, about her capacity to meet challenges and explore the limits of her own talent, and that knowledge was more valuable than any applause or validation from others. That evening at home, she returned to her private piano, the quiet room filled with the soft glow of a desk lamp. She began to play again, revisiting the most difficult sections, refining them further. Her fingers moved with confidence, her mind alert to the smallest details, her heart tuned to the emotional resonance of the music. Each practice session deepened her connection to the piece and strengthened her understanding of her own abilities. She was no longer merely a student following instructions. She was an artist discovering her own voice. Her parents watched quietly, understanding that their child was entering a new stage of her development. They had always known she was talented, but now it was undeniable. Yet she remained humble, absorbed in the process rather than seeking recognition. Her world was private, profound, and entirely her own. The music was a reflection of who she was, and she nurtured it with care, dedication, and love. The night ended with her finally resting, her mind filled with the notes, the melodies, and the subtle challenges of the piece. She understood that the journey was far from over. The assigned piece was not merely a test. It was an opportunity to explore her own limits, to engage with the music deeply, and to begin revealing a talent that had long been hidden from the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and perhaps, slowly, a recognition of what she was truly capable of. But for now, she rested, confident in her progress and committed to continuing her quiet, extraordinary journey. Days turned into weeks, and the young woman continued her rigorous practice in quiet solitude. Each day, she arrived at the music school before anyone else, slipping into the empty practice room where sunlight streamed gently through the tall windows. The piano awaited her like an old friend, and she approached it with a calm familiarity that made the instrument seem almost alive. The assigned piece had grown more complex as she progressed, each section demanding more focus, more precision, and more emotional depth. Yet, she never wavered. To her, every challenge was an invitation to explore something new within herself and within the music. Her teacher observed from time to time, often catching glimpses of the young woman's remarkable progress. She was astonished by how quickly the student had internalized the difficult passages, transforming mechanical practice into expressive performance. It was clear that the young woman was not only technically skilled, but also intuitively understanding the essence of the composition. The teacher began to feel a mixture of awe and concern, realizing that her initial assumptions had been entirely wrong. She had expected struggle, hesitation, and perhaps failure, but instead, she witnessed mastery developing quietly and naturally. At first, her classmates barely noticed. They were busy preparing their own pieces for recitals, practicing scales, or comparing notes on technique and performance strategies. The young woman's quiet determination did not demand attention, and she did not seek it. Yet, over time, whispers began to circulate. Some students peeked into the practice room and noticed the fluidity of her movements, the delicate yet confident touch of her fingers on the keys. Others, more curious than skeptical, asked their teachers if they had observed anything unusual. The response was vague, as the teachers themselves were struggling to articulate what they had seen: a quiet talent, hidden in plain sight, emerging slowly and without fanfare. Her daily routine was simple but intense. She began each session with a careful warm-up, scales, and arpeggios to prepare her fingers and mind. Then she moved to the piece, working through it measure by measure. She experimented with tempo, dynamics, and phrasing, discovering new subtleties with each repetition. When a section proved particularly challenging, she would isolate it, repeating it slowly, dissecting the rhythm and touch until it felt effortless. Then she would integrate it back into the larger piece, ensuring that every note and pause flowed naturally into the next. It was a meticulous process, requiring patience, discipline, and an acute sensitivity to the music itself. Her teachers sometimes interrupted practice sessions to offer advice or correct small technical errors. Yet, she noticed that the student rarely needed guidance. Often, her suggestions were already anticipated, her hands moving in ways that seemed to reflect an internal understanding beyond her years. The teacher began to sense that the young woman possessed a rare kind of musical intelligence, one that combined technical skill, emotional awareness, and intuitive artistry. It was the kind of talent that could not be taught through instruction alone. It had to exist within the person. Meanwhile, the young woman remained completely unaware of the stir she was causing among the faculty. She did not seek approval or recognition. She did not compare herself to her peers or measure her success against theirs. To her, the process of learning and mastering the piece was its own reward. Each day brought new discoveries, small victories, and subtle revelations that deepened her connection to the music. Her focus was inward, on understanding, on refining, and on expressing something that was uniquely her own outside of practice. She moved through the school with the same quiet presence she had always maintained. She attended lessons and group classes, spoke politely when addressed, and offered help to classmates when asked. Yet, no one fully grasped the magnitude of her talent. Some assumed she was simply disciplined and hardworking, a good student among many. Others began to sense that something was different, though they could not articulate it. They noticed the way her hands moved during practice, the fluidity of her performance when she briefly played for the teachers, and the calm confidence she carried. Still, the full extent of her genius remained hidden. One afternoon, the teacher made a decision. She realized that the young woman had progressed far beyond expectations, and that it was time to see how she performed under pressure. She arranged a small session in the recital hall, inviting only a few teachers and senior students to observe. The idea was to watch the young woman play the difficult piece in its entirety and evaluate her overall progress. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Though no one knew exactly what to expect, when the young woman entered the hall, she moved with her usual calmness, carrying her bag and sheet music. She sat up at the piano and briefly adjusted the bench and keys to her comfort. No one in the room made a sound. The teachers exchanged glances, unsure if this performance would confirm her extraordinary progress or reveal gaps in her abilities. The room seemed to hold its breath as she began to play. From the very first notes, it became clear that this was no ordinary performance. Her fingers moved with confidence and fluidity, tracing the complex passages with precision. Yet, what was most remarkable was the expression she brought to the music. Each note, each pause, each shift in tempo conveyed emotion and intention, drawing the listener into the story she was telling through the piano. The teachers leaned forward, silent, watching in disbelief as the piece unfolded seamlessly. As the performance continued, her classmates who had been invited to observe could not help but whisper in awe. They had expected a technically correct performance, perhaps with minor errors or hesitation. Instead, they witnessed a young woman who seemed to inhabit the music fully, who interpreted it with depth and sensitivity, who turned the composition into something alive and moving. The quiet student they had known for months had transformed before their eyes into a true artist. The young woman herself remained focused, almost unaware of the audience, She was absorbed in the music, her attention entirely on the connection between her fingers and the keys, between her heart and the notes, the complexity of the piece, the speed of certain passages, and the subtle emotional shifts did not intimidate her. She navigated them naturally, with an ease that suggested years of intuitive understanding and careful practice. Every chord, every arpeggio, every delicate touch contributed to a performance that was both technically brilliant and emotionally compelling. When the final note faded, a silence hung in the air, heavy and profound. The teachers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others smiling quietly, acknowledging what they had just witnessed. The young woman looked up, still composed, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. She simply closed the piano lid, packed her bag, and nodded politely to the teachers and students. Her calm demeanor unchanged. For the observers, the realization was both thrilling and humbling. They had underestimated her completely. The quiet, unassuming student who had never sought attention or recognition had revealed a genius that could not be ignored. Conversations that followed were filled with astonishment and reflection. The teachers discussed what they had witnessed, analyzing the depth of her skill, the emotional maturity of her interpretation, and the rare combination of discipline, intuition, and creativity she displayed. It was clear that she was not just a talented student, she was a prodigy in the making. Her classmates, too, were affected. Some felt inspired, others slightly embarrassed that they had not recognized her potential earlier. They began to look at her differently, not with envy, but with genuine respect. The young woman, however, remained unchanged in her demeanor. She did not seek validation or attention. Her focus continued to be on the music itself, on the quiet joy of discovery, and on the ongoing process of refining her skill. That evening, she returned home and sat at her own piano. She replayed sections of the piece, exploring new interpretations, experimenting with subtle variations, and deepening her understanding. The performance in the recital hall had been an important milestone, but for her, it was only part of a larger journey. Each note, each phrase, and each pause offered an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to connect more deeply with the music. Her parents observed her quietly, sensing a new level of commitment and depth in their child. They had always known she was gifted, but now it was undeniable. Yet, her humility and focus remained unchanged. She did not play for applause, recognition, or competition. She played because it was a part of who she was, a reflection of her inner world, and a language through which she could express herself fully. In the following days, her routine continued with the same intensity and dedication. She practiced early in the morning, before the school filled with activity, and stayed late into the afternoon, refining her performance. The assigned piece, once daunting, now became a canvas for her creativity and self-expression. She explored subtle dynamics, experimented with phrasing, and even began to discover personal interpretations that added depth and richness to the composition. Each day revealed new layers of understanding and skill. The teachers began to take note of her consistency and growth. They observed not only her technical mastery, but also the way she approached learning, patiently. The day of the first formal performance arrived quietly, almost unannounced. The young woman arrived at the music school early, her bag over her shoulder, a small bundle of sheet music tucked inside. She moved through the hallways as usual, unnoticed by most of her classmates. Some teachers glanced at her, curious to see if she would behave differently on such an important day. She did not. Her calm demeanor remained, and her focus never wavered from the piece that had occupied her every thought for weeks. The recital hall was set up with chairs ranged neatly for the small audience of teachers, students, and a few family members. The lights were bright, reflecting off the polished floor and the shiny black surface of the grand piano. At the center of the stage, there was a quiet tension in the air as performers prepared, tuning instruments, running scales, and quietly discussing their pieces with teachers. The young woman, however, took none of this in. She moved straight to the piano, adjusted the bench, and opened the sheet music calmly. Her fingers hovered above the keys, feeling their texture, as if greeting an old friend. The teacher who had assigned her the piece watched from the side of the stage. There was a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and nervousness on her face. She remembered the countless hours the student had spent in the practice room, the way she had studied the piece measure by measure, and the depth of understanding she had displayed. But seeing her perform in front of an audience was different. The teacher was not entirely sure what to expect, only that it might reveal more about the young woman's extraordinary talent. When the audience quieted, She began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative to anyone else, but in her hands they were deliberate, filled with understanding and subtle emotion. As she continued, the music unfolded with remarkable clarity and depth. Each passage flowed seamlessly into the next, the complexity of the piece handled with precision, the technical challenges met without hesitation. The audience began to sit forward, drawn into the performance, caught in the beauty and mastery that seemed to emerge effortlessly. Her classmates watched in quiet amazement. Some had expected mistakes or hesitation, assuming that the piece was far too difficult for someone so reserved. Instead, they saw control, artistry, and an expressive interpretation that seemed beyond her years. Every note carried weight and emotion. Every pause was deliberate, creating a tension and release that held the listener's attention. The room was silent except for the piano, every sound amplified by the careful attention of those present. The teacher who had assigned the piece felt her heart race. She had known the student was talented, but she had not anticipated the full measure of her ability. The young woman played not to impress or seek recognition, but to communicate, to bring the music to life. Her hands moved with grace and confidence, never hurried, never faltering. There was an unmistakable presence in her performance, an authority that demanded attention even without words. Minutes passed, though to those listening it felt like hours. The young woman navigated the most challenging sections with ease, the rapid scales, intricate chords, and subtle shifts in dynamics handled with skill and sensitivity. The music seemed to flow from her naturally, as if the piano were an extension of her own body and mind. She did not force the notes, did not rush, did not hesitate. She allowed the composition to breathe, to unfold, and in doing so, revealed its full beauty and emotional depth. The audience was captivated. Teachers whispered quietly to one another, unable to hide their astonishment. Some had assumed she was simply an average student, steady but unremarkable. Now they realized how profoundly they had underestimated her. The quiet, disciplined girl who had blended into the background was, in fact, a musician of extraordinary ability, capable of interpreting complex compositions with emotional intelligence and technical mastery that few could match. Her classmates were equally affected. Some were inspired, thinking of how much effort she must have put into understanding the piece so deeply. Others were embarrassed, realizing that they had judged her too quickly, assuming that quietness equaled mediocrity. A few whispered to each other, exchanging surprised looks, trying to understand how someone so unassuming could command such skill and artistry. Yet she remained focused on her music, oblivious to the reactions around her, completely immersed in the performance. The final notes were soft and lingering, fading into silence. The audience remained still, processing what they had just witnessed. There was no immediate applause, as if everyone were collectively holding their breath, unsure of how to respond to such a display of hidden brilliance. The teacher who had assigned the piece finally stepped forward, her expression a mixture of pride and disbelief. She realized she had misjudged her student, assuming a lack of confidence or talent, when in reality, there had been a quiet genius all along. When the applause finally came, it was warm and heartfelt. It began slowly with the teachers, then grew as the students joined in. The young woman remained composed, bowing lightly to acknowledge the audience, her calm demeanor unchanged. She did not seek the spotlight, did not revel in the recognition. The music had been her focus, her companion, and her way of communicating. The applause was a pleasant acknowledgement, but not the reason she had practiced so diligently. After the performance, the teachers gathered to discuss what they had witnessed. The senior teacher spoke first, reflecting on the young woman's discipline, technical skill, and emotional understanding. It was clear that she had not only mastered the piece, but had interpreted it in a way that brought new depth and insight to the music. The others nodded in agreement, their admiration evident, as they realized that they had underestimated the student's potential for far too long. Her classmates approached her cautiously, some offering congratulations, others asking questions about her practice and interpretation. She responded politely, quietly sharing small insights into how she approached the piece, but never boasting or seeking to elevate herself above others. Her focus remained on learning, understanding, and connecting with the music. Her humility and poise only enhanced the respect her peers now felt for her. In the days that followed, the story of her performance spread throughout the school. Teachers spoke of her skill, students whispered about the quiet girl who had astonished everyone, and a new sense of awareness settled over the institution. No longer overlooked, she was recognized as someone with extraordinary talent, a musician whose gifts went far beyond technical ability. Yet, she remained the same person, quiet, focused, and deeply committed to her art. The young woman herself continued to practice. Undeterred by the attention she received, she returned to the piano each day with the same dedication and patience as before. She explored new interpretations, experimented with dynamics, and refined sections of the piece that she had already performed beautifully. Her goal was not recognition or praise, but mastery and understanding, and she approached each day with a calm determination that inspired those around her. Her parents observed her quietly, realizing that their child had achieved something remarkable. They had always known she was talented, but seeing her perform with such skill, confidence, and emotional depth was both humbling and inspiring. Yet, despite the growing recognition from teachers and peers, she remained grounded, focusing on the music rather than the accolades. Her dedication was not to others' approval, but to her own growth, understanding, and connection to the art. The experience of performing in front of an audience, however, did open new doors. Invitations to recitals and small concerts began to arrive. Teachers suggested opportunities for competitions or collaborations. Friends and classmates offered encouragement, and the young woman began to see that her talent, once private, could inspire and move others. Yet, she approached these opportunities cautiously, maintaining her focus on the music itself rather than the attention it might bring. In the weeks that followed, she continued her disciplined practice routine. Each day brought new insights, new challenges, and new levels of understanding. The piece that had once seemed daunting now became a tool for exploration, a canvas for expression, and a mirror of her own growth. She discovered subtle nuances in phrasing, experimented with dynamics, and deepened the emotional resonance of her performance. Every practice session was an opportunity to refine, to learn, and to connect more deeply with the music. Through it all, her quiet presence remained unchanged. She walked the hallways as she always had, polite and composed, never seeking attention or validation. Her classmates and teachers now observed her with newfound respect, recognizing that brilliance does not always announce itself loudly. The young woman's journey had revealed the power of quiet dedication, patience, and the ability to listen deeply to the music, the world, and oneself. She had begun to transform not only her own understanding of her talent, but also the perceptions of those around her. By the end of the month, the young woman had solidified her mastery of the difficult piece. She could play it flawlessly, with technical precision and emotional depth. Yet she remained humble. Her joy derived not from recognition, but from the process itself. The performance had been a turning point, revealing her genius to the world, but it had not changed her fundamental approach to music: calm, focus. After her remarkable performance, the young woman returned to her daily routine. Yet the atmosphere around her had subtly changed. Teachers who had once overlooked her now watched with a careful eye, still somewhat skeptical, but increasingly aware of the quiet force she possessed. They exchanged glances in the staff room, whispering about the student who had gone unnoticed for so long and had now revealed a talent that seemed almost impossible to ignore. Some admitted their earlier underestimation, feeling a mix of embarrassment and admiration, while others quietly resolved to observe her progress more closely. Her classmates also reacted differently. Some approached her hesitantly, asking questions about her practice techniques or how she approached certain passages of the piece. Others watched from a distance, curious and perhaps inspired. Though unsure how to interact with someone whose abilities they could barely comprehend, there was a sense of tension among them, a recognition that they had underestimated someone who had always seemed ordinary. Yet she remained unchanged, calm, and focused. Her priorities still rooted entirely in the music itself rather than any recognition or attention. The young woman herself was aware of the growing curiosity, but it did not distract her. She understood that her journey was internal, a process of discovery and growth that could not be measured by accolades or social approval. Each day, she continued to arrive early at the school, slipping into the quiet practice room where the piano awaited. She warmed up with scales and arpeggios, then focused on the challenging piece, working to refine her interpretation and deepen her understanding of its emotional and technical complexities. Her dedication remained unwavering, her focus entirely on mastering the music. Her teacher observed her closely, noticing the subtle improvements that continued to emerge with each session. Even after the public performance, the young woman pushed herself to explore nuances, experimenting with dynamics, phrasing, and tempo in ways that revealed a profound sensitivity and maturity. The teacher found herself both amazed and humbled. It became clear that the young woman's talent was not only remarkable, but also continuous. and evolving, with each day bringing new insights and levels of mastery. The quiet genius that had been overlooked for so long was now impossible to ignore. One afternoon, the teacher decided to test her understanding further. She suggested that the student try an even more complex section of the piece that had previously been avoided because of its difficulty. This was not a public performance, merely a private assessment to gauge whether the young woman could adapt and interpret new challenges within the composition. She agreed without hesitation, taking the music in her hands and carefully analyzing the difficult passage. When she played, the teacher could hardly believe her eyes and ears. Every note, chord, and rhythm was executed with precision and expression beyond what had been anticipated. She adapted seamlessly, showing not only technical skill, but a remarkable intuition and sensitivity to the music. The teacher could not contain her admiration. She realized she had misjudged the young woman's potential in countless ways, assuming a lack of initiative where there was in fact deep thought, humility where there was extraordinary intelligence, and quietness where there was strength. The private performance revealed something even more profound than the public one. The student was not merely capable of playing the notes. She understood the music at a level that went beyond technique. She interpreted, she shaped, she breathed life into the composition in a way that was both personal and universally resonant. News of the young woman's talent began to spread beyond the school walls. A few teachers mentioned her skill to colleagues in other institutions, describing a student whose abilities were rare and extraordinary. Some local musicians and mentors expressed interest, suggesting that she might benefit from further study or participation in more advanced performances. Invitations and recommendations quietly arrived, offering opportunities that had previously seemed out of reach. Yet, despite the growing attention, the young woman remained focused on her process rather than the potential fame or recognition. She practiced because she loved the music, because she was discovering something deeply personal and meaningful in each note and phrase. Her peers began to adjust their perceptions. Some sought to learn from her, asking questions about her techniques, her approach to challenging passages, and her mindset during practice. They realized that her dedication and patience were as integral to her talent as her technical skill. Others were inspired by her discipline and focus, reflecting on their own practices and ambitions. She did not boast or demonstrate superiority. Instead, her quiet confidence and skill spoke for themselves, inspiring respect and admiration through example rather than words. At home, her parents noticed a subtle transformation in her approach to the piano. She no longer only aimed to perfect a piece. She sought to interpret, explore, and understand it deeply. Her practice sessions were longer and more immersive, filled with careful observation, experimentation, and reflection. They recognized that she had entered a new phase in her development, one in which her natural talent was merging with a growing maturity and artistic insight. Her love for music remained central, untainted by external pressures or expectations. Yet her skill and understanding had grown in ways that were tangible and extraordinary. During a particularly quiet afternoon, she began to experiment with creating subtle variations within the piece, adding her own emotional interpretation while respecting the original structure. She explored phrasing and timing, adjusting the pressure and speed of her fingers to create nuanced effects. Each modification was deliberate, informed by a deep internal sense of rhythm and expression. She played and replayed sections, listening critically, refining the sound, and internalizing the flow of the music in ways that deepened her understanding and expanded her creative abilities. It was not improvisation for show, but exploration for understanding and growth. As weeks passed, her reputation grew, though she remained largely unaware of it. Teachers from the school began recommending her for small performances, competitions, and collaborations. Each opportunity was approached with the same calm determination and humility she had always shown. She did not perform for validation. She performed to understand, to explore, and to communicate through the music. Each new challenge was met with curiosity, focus, and a quiet sense of readiness, reinforcing the depth and consistency of her talent. Her relationship with her teachers evolved. They began to engage her in discussions about interpretation, musicality, and emotional expression. They provided guidance and feedback, but increasingly, they recognized that she often anticipated their suggestions and insights independently. They realized she possessed not only technical mastery, but a rare ability to understand music intuitively, to anticipate its emotional and structural demands, and to express it in a personal yet universally resonant way. Their admiration grew, tempered by the humility and focus of the student. who never sought recognition or praise. Her classmates, too, began to respond differently. Some were inspired by her work ethic and artistic insight, seeking to emulate her approach. Others acknowledged that their previous assumptions had been misguided, reflecting on the subtle ways in which brilliance can be quiet, hidden, and unexpected. The young woman's example subtly shifted the culture within the school, emphasizing dedication, patience, and deep engagement with music over superficial displays or performance-based validation. She became a model not through words or self-promotion, but through consistent, quiet excellence. In her private practice sessions, she continued to refine her performance. She worked on the most challenging sections, seeking fluidity, emotional resonance, and technical precision. She listened critically, adjusting timing, touch, and expression to achieve the fullest understanding and interpretation possible. Each day added depth and maturity, transforming her from a talented student into an artist capable of expressing subtlety, emotion, and complexity through her music. Despite the attention and growing recognition, she remained grounded. She understood that true mastery was not measured by applause or accolades, but by the connection she could achieve with the music, the depth of understanding she could cultivate, and the personal satisfaction that came from quiet, deliberate growth. Her focus was inward, on the process, on discovery, and on refining her abilities. The external world, with its praise and curiosity, remained secondary, a backdrop to the profound work she was accomplishing in the practice room. In this phase of her journey, the young woman discovered something even more important: the ability to inspire quietly. Her example showed teachers, peers, and even family members that true talent often goes unnoticed, that patience and dedication can reveal hidden brilliance, and that humility does not diminish genius. She became a reminder that observation, understanding, and quiet effort often hold more power than attention-seeking or outward display. As she continued her practice, each note played, each measure refined, and each interpretation explored reinforced her growth. She remained unassuming, focused, and deeply connected to her music. Her journey, once private and almost invisible, was now shaping not only her own understanding and skill, but also the perceptions and